right. Hi, folks. Welcome back for another Climate, People, Environment Program seminar. And thanks for being willing to join with us remotely. The weather yesterday was not so conducive for getting our speaker to come visit, but she has graciously agreed to present remotely. So our speaker today is Starlyn Miller from the Wilderness Society. And I'm going to go ahead and actually pass off the introduction to Ashley Grease, who helped nominate Starlyn. And before I do that, just want to make sure that folks, of course, stay on mute while they're during the program. If you do have questions during the talk, just go ahead and add them to the chat and we'll come back to them at the end. We'll save some time at the end for questions and the talk will be recorded. So with that, I will pass it on. Thanks. Go ahead, Ashley.
Thanks, Anchor. My name is Ashley Grice. I'm the Senior Program Coordinator at the Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals and a UW-Madison Institute alumna. I am very happy to be here today to introduce Starlyn Miller, whom I worked with very briefly at the Wilderness Society. Starlyn is currently the Native Lands Partnership Director at the Wilderness Society, where she leads the Native Lands Partnership team in developing policy priorities and positions that advance the protection of cultural and sacred sites, co-management on public lands, and large landscape protection that centers Native and Indigenous peoples' history, sovereignty, and interests. Before starting at the Wilderness Society, Starlyn was the Assistant Tribal Attorney for the Menominee Indian Tribe of Wisconsin, where she advised on complex legal and strategic issues to assist the nation in exercising and protecting tribal sovereignty and furthering tribal self-determination. Starlyn is a member of the State Bar of Wisconsin and a double badger, holding a JD from UW-Madison Law School and a BS in Education from UW-Madison, and a certificate in American Indian Studies and Creative Writing. Starlyn is an enrolled member of the Little Shell Chippewa Tribe of Montana and a direct descendant of Menominee and Stockbridge Munsee. And with that, I will turn it over to our speaker, Starlyn. Thank you for being here.
Loanne and Ashley, appreciate you. I'm going to share my screen now. Hope they all goes well. Let's see here. Are you seeing what I'm seeing?
I see a hello everyone slide.
Yeah. All right, here we go. Poso Moau Nuiak. Oops, my thing's not changing. Hang on one second.
Okay.
Actually, Starlyn, I think we might be seeing the wrong screen. We're seeing the presenter view.
Okay.
Do you want to stop sharing and try sharing again? And maybe we can get the
Yes, I'm
the
so
other one.
sorry.
Okay. No, but all good.
How about that?
Perfect.
Great.
All right, let's see here. All right, so we'll start again. Poso Moau Nuiak. And I can't get the slides to turn. I don't know why. Hang on one second, guys. Nuiswin Starlyn Miller. Netskiwakin Sawano Wishkoshik. Shake Omatnomane. Skonikan. Mishik Wapanakai. Skonikan. Nonat Awe Scott Turtleat Kenuk. Mishik Nakia Awe Antoinette Veely. Bo Miller Awe Anani. Nikitsak Awe Miles Opamat. Mashik Moss Campbell. Natan Awe Merrill Blue. And as Ashley just addressed, I'm a UW alumni, a former tribal attorney for two nations, descendant of Menominee and Mohican nations, and a Little Shell Chippewa tribal citizen. Currently the director for the Wilderness Society Native Lands Partnerships. And I want to pause here just to talk about the way that I introduced myself. It might have kind of read like a family album for some of you. But in tribal community, we introduce ourselves through relationships. That's very common. And, these can get really long. Sometimes we can go into our grandparents, our great-grandparents, and on and on. Some people may add clans. They may add their traditional names. Again, the focus is on relationships, and that's super important to understand when working with tribal nations and communities. And then there's this slide, which focuses on education and career, which is very normal and typical for institutions that we all work and live in, but may not mean much to a tribal community. So already we're seeing a demonstration of the differences in the way one might show up when working in the sphere of native lands partnerships and conservation. Moving on to the main presentation today, you'll note a picture there of Woody Guthrie. And the title of my presentation, This Land is Our Land, Native Lands Partnerships and Conservation, is a play off of this song. And we probably all heard it when we were in kindergarten. This land is your land, from sea to shining sea. It's actually an alternative national anthem, but Indigenous people would point out that the core of this song comes from a colonialist message. J-Lo recently sang it at Biden's inauguration. And you can read more about this in a National Public Radio post, February 13th of 2021. But the colonialist message is this: Manifest Destiny, the Doctrine of Discovery by Pope Alexander VI in 1493, to colonize the Americas and its native peoples as subjects. And it's a right of all Americans because, well, this land was supposedly made for you by a higher power. But the truth is that the song further perpetuates misinformation, misconceptions on land dispossession of tribal nations and Indigenous people. And remember, for his time, Woody Guthrie was a revolutionary, singing to empower the people against the federal government, actually. But like many institutions we work in, he was working from a colonialist framework. Similarly, there are methods in conservation and many institutions, including university systems, that have benefited from land dispossession of tribal nations and Indigenous people. Now, I am a proud Badger. I claim the title of a double Badger, and I wouldn't be where I am today without that education. But the UW system is a land-grant university, which means it directly benefited from the sale of tribal nation lands in order to become the great institution it is today. The difference is our willingness to accept that truth, and then once we know it, what we can collectively do and inclusively do to move forward. It can also be true that it's a great university and that it had a role in land dispossession. Those two truths can exist simultaneously. There was a recent article that explored this topic, and I highly recommend it to you all. It's by Alyssa Mohan, and it's on teaching Indigenous land dispossession in Wisconsin and beyond, and the interdisciplinary group of UW-Madison faculty and graduate students right now, as we speak, working to create educational models to teach this history. And I think that's going to be a theme that you see throughout this presentation. The more that we inform ourselves and educate ourselves, the better that we can do in our work, no matter what work you do. And folks, if we're not uncomfortable, then we're not having the right conversations. Again, two truths can stand next to each other simultaneously. The truth that the UW system provides a great education to its students. I am a product of that system, but also the fact that the UW system benefited directly from Indigenous land dispossession is also true. And this story is not dissimilar to the work in conservation at the Wilderness Society, to your work, or to any of our nation's history. And once we learn that history, we can make better choices going forward. So a roadmap of what we're going to discuss today, a little bit about the Wilderness Society and its history, its creation story, Native Lands Partnerships and how it formed and some of the work that it does, and Native Voices Forward, some best practices that hopefully I can leave you guys with. The Wilderness Society is a nonprofit conservation organization, and it's 88 years old. I'm lucky to know a few elders that are older than 88 years old, and they will tell you that there are so much changed in their lifetime. Our mission at the Wilderness Society today is to unite people to protect America's wild places. Our vision is a future where people and wild nature flourish together, meeting the challenges of a rapidly changing planet. You can check out our principles. Those are a little bit longer on our website. Quickly, our values focus on trust and collaboration, community and commitment, solutions and science. And finally, we have a public land acknowledgement, and I think that's important to raise here. The Wilderness Society recognizes Native American and Indigenous people as the longest serving stewards of land. And we respect sovereignty, self-determination. We honor treaty rights, including reserved rights that exist off reservation. We also acknowledge historic and ongoing injustices perpetuated against Indigenous peoples. And we're working harder to center our Indigenous and tribal nation partners. So a little bit of history about the Wilderness Society. It started in 1935, founded to save America's dwindling wildlands. It was founded by a group of, at the time, visionaries. Some of the names you might know: Aldo Leopold, Robert Marshall, Robert Sterling Yard, Benton McKay, Ernest Oberholzer, Harvey Broom, Bernard Frank, Harold C. Anderson. At the time, it was a revolutionary idea to conserve the wildest places in America, from extraction, from logging, mining, and other development. But again, you know, with 2020 hindsight here in 2023, you'll notice that women are missing from that group, and certainly tribal nations and other marginalized groups such as Black, Asian, and Latino people. 1964 is when the Wilderness Act was signed by President Lyndon Johnson to create a way for Americans to protect their most natural and unspoiled wildlands. The result was that 9.1 million acres of land was put into the National Wilderness Preservation System. And most importantly, it set the framework for decades of wilderness conservation. It was written and championed by this picture here of Howard Zahniser. And some may argue that while it preserved lots of land and it's done good, much like this concept we talked about before, the UW system is a great system. I got a great education from it. That is true. So is it true that the Wilderness Act preserved lands? But some could also argue that it further severed relationships of tribal nations and Indigenous people, their access to spaces that they've stewarded for more than 10,000 years, in some cases. You can learn more about velvet rope conservation. That's what Robin Wall Kimmerer calls it in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass. If you haven't read that book, it's a fantastic book to look at. But we still grapple internally with this concept of wilderness, our name, and the act. And we're having really hard conversations internally, but good conversations. In 1976, the first woman to lead a national conservation group was Celia Hunter, and she worked for the Wilderness Society. She was passionate about Alaska and its public lands and worked very hard to protect those lands. Some of the fruits of her work are that in 1978, under President Carter, 56 million acres of land in Alaska was set aside and protected as wilderness under the Antiquities Act. It was an example under President Jimmy Carter of 15 new national monuments where presidential power came into play. And Congress learned that if they weren't willing to act, there were some other mechanisms that the president could enact under the Antiquities Act. And it's still a model that we use today. So I'm skipping a bunch of history here just because we only have so much time. But I'm jumping forward to 2016. What I would say is between that time period of 78, or even from the founding really, to 2016, the Wilderness Society supported through congressional and administrative actions and or led at least 111 million acres of wilderness protected. So that's a significant amount of land that we've worked to help protect. But in 2016, we officially launched our commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion at the Wilderness Society. This means that we have a renewed effort to ensure our work reflects cultures and perspectives of people and communities across our nation, and a commitment to helping all people, regardless of their backgrounds, be able to know, have access to, and enjoy public lands. What some people might not connect, but I connected, was that 2016 was also the year that the world learned about Standing Rock and Dakota Access Pipeline. and what Indigenous people were willing to do in order to defend sacred sites. It was one of the largest gatherings of Native Americans that the nation noticed in media since Wounded Knee in 1973. In 2017, we had a record 34 monument designations under President Obama, and the Wilderness Society advocated for expansion of California coastal Cascade Siskiyou National Monuments, capping off a remarkable effort in monument designations. We work to protect other places like the Badger UW-Madison, which we'll talk about a little bit further on in the presentation, and work to cancel a lot of the leases of oil and gas leases in that area, as well as blocking new drilling in much of the Arctic Ocean. An example of the monument designation as it relates to Native lands partnerships is Bears Ears, which is affiliated with 5 Native tribal nations: the Hopi tribe, Navajo tribe, Ute Mountain Ute Indian tribe of Unita and Ouray Reservation. Because of its monument designation, 100,000 plus archaeological and cultural sites were protected, 18 endangered species. This is really a monumental effort between conservation and tribal nations. And you can see on the right, our president, Jamie Williams there with the glasses on the far right. So he's a part of the signing ceremony, which was really special. Now, a lot of this work has been done before I was at the agency. I mean, I only came in June of this year. So I'm covering a lot of things that we've had long held relationships on the ground through our landscape teams. And that's the focus of this slide. We've had a great relationship with the Confederated Salish Kootenai tribe. And I want to talk about their bison range and how TWS work to have a long-term relationship with them, first by showing up in that community and asking for nothing, just going and listening. And there's a very special person, Ann Carlson, who holds that relationship and is doing amazing work that we seek to model throughout our organization. So I just would like to highlight her for a moment for her hard work. She worked to gain the trust of CSKT, and as a result, she helped them with a climate adaptation and mitigation plan, helped them write that. There's been revisions to that since, but a big project was the bison range. And we're going to play a little clip so we can learn more about that here.
It's a massive feat and undertaking, what he did, to go out of his way to bring those bison back.
Atatitsa realized that we had that cultural imperative to save them from extinction.
To get them from the place where they were back to the Flathead Reservation, it's really truly amazing.
It was a taking. It was just like the homestead, whether you liked it or not, they were going to do it. And you had to find a way to deal with it.
It caused a lot of social strife and caused economic collapse of what had previously existed. People went from being taken care of and their lifestyle was okay to total poverty. Then to add further insult to it, they said, you know what, I joked, we want to bring the buffalo back and we're going to take even more land from it.
The government took many of the same animals that were here and put them back on this land that they took from us. The notion of bringing them back and bringing them back to the reservation was seen as very positive until they put a fence around it.
The Indians knew. You don't go on the other side of that fence anymore. That's no longer Indian country.
And the tribes at the time exerted a federal principle of self-governance to be able to manage the bison range.
I was raised in central Montana, and I can tell you there was a great deal of misunderstanding in the white world about tribes and about tribal cultures and the interests they had in natural resources.
You've got a lot of good people here, but you still have a few people that
really resent the Indian. And their voices are really loud.
It's not about locking anybody out. It's not about allowing certain people in there. It's about sharing, it's about understanding.
So what better caretakers of keeping buffalo on the landscape in perpetuity than the native people that were here and watched them evolve and assisted with their existence.
And you can see the full video. If there's a longer version, like 25 minutes, if you just YouTube In the Spirit of Atatitse. Again, going back to that theme of educating and making space for storytelling from the nation, that's what TWS is doing as it helps its partners. So we help fund this storytelling piece. And again, it's from the perspective of the tribe to help educate the public about the importance of this space. The National Bison Range was in the heart of the reservation, the Flathead Indian Reservation, and it was established in 1908. It consisted of approximately 19,000 acres. So you can imagine it was a real heartbreak for CSKT to see this bison range being managed by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in the middle of their reservation. After their efforts, and you'll learn more about the spirit of Atatitse if you watch that video, to save the original bison herds. And so I'm happy to tell you that in December 27th of 2020, the president signed the bison range restoration legislation, which returned this bison range to CSKT. They now manage it. It's a beautiful place to visit. I'd encourage you to go. It's open to the public, but it's another example of TWS playing a supportive role through long-term partnerships on the ground, holding space, and helping to educate the public about the importance of saving spaces like this and having tribes lead in these spaces. Another example of some of our work is 2022 Rappahannock and Phones Cliff. Phones Cliff is a stunning 4-mile stretch of white colored reflective cliffs rising more than 100 feet above Rappahannock River in Virginia. It's a majestic site and it's the ancestral home of the Rappahannock tribe. They are a federally recognized sovereign nation headquartered in King and Queen County, Virginia. It's a largely unspoiled landscape, very culturally important to the tribe. And on April 1st, 2022, at an event with U.S. Department of the Interior Secretary Deborah Haaland, the Rappahannock tribe announced that it had reacquired 465 acres at Phones Cliff. And they restored the original name of the cliff, Pissacoac. The land is publicly accessible. It's held with a permanent conservation easement conveyed to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Chesapeake Conservancy donated the easement to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, then donated the fee title to the Rappahannock tribe. Their intention is to place it into trust with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which can be a long process. The tribe plans trails, a replica of a 16th century village. Again, the intention is to educate the public about Rappahannock history and indigenous approaches to conservation, and also connect future generations of Rappahannock youth to their tribal traditions along the river. And TWS played a supporting role among many other conservation organizations with this effort. It was unique for TWS in that, we are a public lands focused organization, and on the East Coast, this is a model that I think could be replicated many times over because there's a unique history there of removal of indigenous nations from the East Coast. You've heard of the Trail of Tears. Many nations from the East Coast have similar trails of tears, including my own Mohican nation as well. They were removed 9 times to their present day reservation in Wisconsin. But again, what was super important about this work was, not necessarily being the lead in the face of this. The tribe is the leader in it, but being behind the scenes and helping connect players in order for this important event to happen. And so that's the role that TWS played. And again, I think it's a model that we could replicate with many private lands on the East Coast. There's just not as much federal land to kind of have the same approaches that we do in the West as we do in the East. So for that reason, I think it's super important. And we continue to hold a very good relationship with Chief Ann Richardson, who is chairman of the tribe. The Badger 2 Medicine is the sacred homeland of the Blackfeet Nation. It's a home to their creation story, and it's been a place of refuge and healing for more than 10,000 years. We would say it's located on Lewis and Clark National Forest land and located between Glacier National Park and the Bob Marshall Wilderness and Blackfeet Reservation. And I'm going to play a little clip from that, which TWS also helps support to educate the public about the importance of it from the Blackfeet perspective.
We've been here since the beginning of time. Our creation stories involve the lands and landscape here.
We have teepee rings and ceremonial structures that date back 10,000 years.
Our world was tied to the land. We were the land and the land was us. It wasn't until after 1805 and the American Louisiana Purchase, where they, in their minds, thought they bought this territory that was ours, that we began to have contact with the Americans.
My great-great-great-grandfather, his name was Wolf Calf. He was around 12 years old when he fought Meriwether Lewis.
Captain Lewis and three of his best men encountered a group of our Blackfeet teenagers. Captain Lewis told us through sign language that now the Americans were the new bosses in town, and soon we're going to be trading firearms to your enemies. So none of this was going over too well. And the boys whispered to themselves, let's pull off the coup of the century. Let's humble the Americans.
And of course, what the young boys didn't know is they were dealing with some very skilled military trained individuals.
And in that battle, one of them was stabbed to death. And another one was shot in the back running away.
This was an initial blood that was drawn by the Americans. There was no way we could have suspected that this first conflict incident would become not just a flood, a tsunami that would practically carry our people away.
They beat us through germ warfare. And that didn't kill us off enough. They killed all the buffalo. So we starved to death. Then when that didn't work, put us on reservations.
We used to be in Fort Benton. That was our agents. They pushed us to Shodo. From Shodo, they pushed us what is called old agents. They pushed us here. It wasn't for these mountains, they pushed us into Pacific Ocean. This is where we stopped. And this is what we're going to fight for this area that we call our home.
So again, you can check out the YouTube video, the longer version of it. Both of the clips I shared with you are worth the time in watching that history as expressed by the tribal members and tribal nations affiliated. What I will tell you is that today, Badger 2 Medicine is something we continue to work on with the Blackfeet Nation. Today, there remains only one oil and gas lease in the Badger to Madison area. It's held by Solinex, a company. This lease was canceled in 2016, but reinstated in 2018 after the Washington, D.C. District Court ruled. The federal government and the Wilderness Society are interveners and are currently challenging this lower court ruling and the lease in the D.C. Court of Appeals. And TWS continues to work through relationships on the ground with the Blackfeet Nation to help support culture camps, language camps, and youth reconnecting to the Badger to Madison area as planned by the tribe and elders. So you've seen a lot of good work being done in partnership with tribal nations and some great successes for both the Wilderness Society and tribal nations and Indigenous partners. There's a strong desire to ensure that these models that I talked about are replicated throughout our organization. And so through a concerted effort, we did have an internal review at TWS, which focused on ways to center Indigenous partners in 2018. We developed a framework document. These are all organizational things I'm talking about that are important to take note of, because I think if you're striving to change the organizations you might be working for, it does take developing documents and ensuring that there's consensus to have growth within your organization. And they may not be perfect, they are works in progress, but they definitely have helped us get to where we're at today. I was mentioning a 2020 framework document. We'll kind of go through that in a little minute more. It's adopted by our governing council. So we don't have many documents that are adopted at that level. So it's a very important document. We also have interns that have worked, like Ashley Grease, who have worked on wonderful documents like our Pathways to Land Justice report. And because of those things, it was decided that a director of Native Lands Partnerships needed to be hired. And that was why I was hired, to make sure that we're streamlining our work and we're doing good models throughout our organization. We have an advisory work group. It's newly formed in 2022 as well. And that's composed of executive staff, organizational staff, and governing council members. And basically, I bring issues to that advisory group to have them help me work through issues. So if we want to develop a new policy, or for instance, we're working right now on traditional ecological knowledge and maybe getting a little bit more in depth and in the weeds on that issue. We do have a position statement that we'll cover in our framework document, but that's an example of how I can bring things to this work group and make sure that it cuts across the full organization with their support. It does have a charter and it meets quarterly. The current NLP team is small but mighty. It consists of myself, Jennifer Ferenstein, who is part-time. She splits her time with NLP and also with Badger to Madison work. And then we have an intern, Daniel Williams, who is fantastic as well. And I appreciate my team very much, but there is a need to build up capacity, and that's very clear to me on a day-to-day basis. Some of our priorities are listed here on the left. I'm not going to go through all of these. You can read them. But I would say overall, there are 4 main categories of work coming in the door. And within those categories, we seek to do and elevate these priorities. We have organizational work. So education of our staff. How are we growing as an organization and showing up with our tribal nation partners? We have national policies, legislation, and media efforts that we need to make sure are consistent with our framework documents, with how we've promised to show up with our tribal nation partners. And we also have landscape work, and that's very good for local solutions and relationships and advocacy work. The 4th category, and they all kind of interrelate and overlap each other, but I would say is relationship building. And I would encourage others to really think deeply on this. Going back to that first slide about how you show up in tribal community, it's all about your relationship, and even speaking the Menominee language to you. Baked into that language is my relationship to things, people, places. It's a worldview, it's a perspective of the world. And so that is how I see language, Indigenous language, important to conservation work, because it has a lot of that wisdom and knowledge. So some of the things that we work to do is increase Indigenous voice, whether it be through staff or vendors, partners. We always want to be sure that we're, showing up and not being a burden to our tribal nation partners. So where they have capacity needs, I mentioned like a mitigation plan for climate adaptation that was identified by a tribe, and how can we show up to help them write that if they trust us? That's a good example. Never coming there with a solution to their quote unquote problems as we see them. That's not the way to do our work. And sometimes it's hard to shift that paradigm because we often come up with some great ideas, but we have to be sure that we're working from those priorities in tribal community. And I take that really serious in Native Lands partnership work. And so that last bullet point of achieving meaningful conservation outcomes and advance through place-based work, policy, and administrative steps, I'm going to get into a little bit more here. So how this translates is, we do a lot of work with protecting sacred sites. We're an 88-year-old institution, and we have deep legislative and policy roots. We're a master at understanding the system. But the synergy of NLP work comes when priority issues as raised by our tribal nation partners and meaningful conservation goals held by TWS can be elevated together to achieve legislative, policy, and or administrative actions that make a difference and advance tribal and conservation outcomes. So an example of that would be sacred sites protection or co-management or reconciliation in place names. Those are three things that we're actively working on right now. And so there's legislation that we've helped to write regarding advancing Tribal Parity on Public Lands Act and Tribal Cultural Area Systems Act. We've worked with tribal leaders from across the country to build support for these proposals. And they're currently endorsed by numerous tribes, tribal associations, and tribal organizations. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get it passed last Congress, but we continue to work on it throughout this Congress. The importance of it would be to establish permanent protections for tribal cultural sites on public lands, prevent the disposal of sacred sites, support tribal management of cultural resources on public land, and have a cultural area system, which would be the first ever national system of protected tribal cultural sites, providing tribes a stronger role in the stewardship of these sites. So we helped orchestrate, Red Road to DC to try to make sure that legislators and people understand that we need to protect sacred places. And we work with partners like Native American Organizers Alliance and others to help get that message across. We also have done some work on racist and offensive place names in the United States. We work with the National Association of Tribal Historic Preservation Officers, or NAHPO. If you don't know that group, you should know that group. They're a great group. And they work with lots of TIPOs. So we work with them to provide a guide to changing racist and offensive place names in the United States, because it isn't an easy process. And so it's a free resource that aims to make it easier for First Nations, grassroots organizations, and local leaders to change offensive place names near their communities. You can check that out. I'm sure it's on our website, or if you Google it, you might be able to find it. We follow DOI initiatives closely. So similarly to the racist and offensive place names work, we recently applauded Secretary Holland's administrative act of changing the offensive name of hundreds of rivers, mountains, and canyons from an offensive slur against Native American women to names that reflect the local character of each place. With one administrative action, Secretary Holland struck nearly 650 geographic features with the S word on it, which means a lot to me as an Indigenous woman with nieces and a daughter, that word is not reflected in our public places. We're closely following co-management agreements that DOI has executed, and any guidance that comes from departments, such as their recent CEQ guidance on traditional ecological knowledge. I think that was the Office of Science and Technology and Policy that just issued that document, and that's worth a read if you have not read that. Going back to the organizational framework document adopted by our governing council, I'm not going to get into each of these because I know we're short on time here, but I think it's important to note that our organization has a document with position statements so that staff are educated about it and understand where we sit as an organization as it relates to certain relationships with Indigenous partners. So it helps educate staff, it helps with expectations of staff and accountability of the organization as a whole. So we have a statement on protection of cultural areas that we support them, a statement on traditional knowledge. There are many versions of traditional knowledge, and if you look at that CEQ guidance, it kind of talks about the definition, which is a work in progress for the Wilderness Society. But again, we support traditional knowledge and incorporating it where we can with federal agencies and tribal partners, respecting every tribe as we do that based on their wants and needs. Some tribes, they may want to share that, and other nations do not want to share that knowledge. And so there isn't a one size fits all approach to these answers. And that's, I think, the most important message to get. And that we try to tell staff as well, that you have to be flexible. It's about relationship building. And once you have trust and partnership, the nations and your Indigenous partners will let you know what's appropriate. We have a statement on traditional names and returning traditional names to public lands, especially where they're inappropriate or offensive. We have a statement on, or position statement on government to government consultation, and how we recognize that tribal nations are sovereign nations. We support that process and we're not going to usurp it. It is a federal relationship that the government has with tribal nations for consultation. And we also always want to uplift that and never get in the way of that. But equally important, well, I wouldn't say equally important, but it's important to the Wilderness Society that we're also having that consultation with our partners on issues that may affect them. So making sure that we get them the information earliest that we can, making sure that they understand the information that we may have on a given site, and making sure that we're listening to the concerns and priorities of that community is very important parts of consultation and principles of consultation. We support access. That is a huge issue, especially with wilderness areas. Sometimes access is cut off from Indigenous nations. There are some principles where federal recognized tribes still have access, but it's not as easy for states that are, or tribes that are state recognized. We were just talking with a gentleman who's a fellow who is encountering some issues for the UW-Madison tribe in California. And so they're having to use scientific permits in order to access lands, and they cannot gather and make basketry and keep that basketry because they don't have that federal recognition status. And so that's something we continue to listen to and work on, because again, all the lands that we are on were once Indigenous lands and are Indigenous lands. There are the ancestral homelands of tribal nations and Indigenous people. We support sovereignty and treaty rights, co-management, land into trust. And, you know, there are cases where this can get a little bit more complex depending on where we are, you know, who we're dealing with. So in some cases we have a case-by-case basis, but I think what's good about that is that it makes us transparent, that, you know, as a federal public lands organization, there are some things that we're not going to be able to commit to, but being transparent about that is equally as important to our partners. Tribal priorities, we have a statement on that. We want to ensure that we're promoting those priorities, including preserving language and culture, enhancing the stewardship of tribal lands, and securing federal recognition. If that's something that a tribe is interested in, we seek to support that. Again, as a whole, this 2020 framework document that was adopted by our governing council helps our organization be accountable to our tribal partners, to ourselves. And it was developed from consensus, and it's a commitment that's written that I think really helps ground some of our work, especially when issues and cases are a little bit more complex as well. It's a guideline. So moving to the last part of the presentation, how am I on time here? Running a little short. So I'm going to run through this quick. Decolonizing your work, Native voices forward, best practices. You have to start from a framework of respecting tribal sovereignty, treaty rights, and self-determination. Everything emanates from that. Recognize that all lands are ancestral lands of Indigenous people. And the biggest thing that I can express to you from all of the models that have worked at the Wilderness Society and our partnerships is to seek education. And that may be because I'm biased with my degree in education, never becoming a teacher like maybe I should have, but really, it wasn't until I was in college that I started to learn, even as an Indigenous person, about federal Indian law policies and history. And that's sad. We've got Act 31 in Wisconsin, but the enforcement of it is another question. And the content of the curriculum is another question. It really wasn't there when I was a kid. So UW system, American Indian Studies program, sadly was the first time I heard about federal Indian law policy and history, and it rocked my world, changed my world, helped me find my place in my world. So I would encourage you, if you haven't taken a class or you don't know what they're about, check them out. We have some amazing Indigenous UW alumni, and they're doing amazing work. So check out work by Dr. Sassanese Jennings, who just helped develop the new UW tribal consultation policy, like spot on to how we should be working with the nations within the state of Wisconsin. Act 31 education resources by David O'Connor and Aaron Burberry. You can check that out on the website. That tells you all about the 11 federally recognized tribes in the state of Wisconsin and one tribe that is not federally recognized, the Brotherton tribe. You can read a new book called In Defense of Sovereignty by Dr. Rebecca Webster, also a Badger and a practicing tribal attorney. She's now a professor. She talks about her experience protecting sovereignty for the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin. You could check out Dr. Crystal Lepsher's dissertation and presentation on listening for the Canaries, addressing racial battle fatigue in First Nation students in higher education. Support Indigenous-led organizations like APIO, Wangshik, Indigenous Law Students Association, NACHIP, the group I mentioned who's working on UW land grant university issues in education. They're doing some great work. The point of these groups is that they support Indigenous students and voice, and they hold space to make our systems better because of that. Also, you should be seeking long-term relationships. It's been a challenge, I'm going to be honest. Working in the conservation world, there are all of these pressures from Congress and deadlines for rulemaking, and administration is going out, and this one's coming in. But the biggest lesson that I think we need to learn from is our long-term relationships with Indigenous nations, that they can sustain any of those waves. They've been here and they've been resilient for forever, since time immemorial. We need to fight the invisibility narrative where we are invited and amplify tribal nations and Indigenous voice. There is misconceptions out there that Indigenous people, Native Americans do not exist and are, not in everybody's world every day or even in the media. That's starting to change. You're seeing that with Reservation Dogs and some really neat shows that are coming up. But we need to continue to work very, very pointedly on fighting that invisibility narrative. Seek consensus building, show up, like I mentioned, Ann Carlson did, and don't have an agenda. Don't have an expectation or a deadline. Just show up to learn in community. Be humble and have an open heart. That's what my elders always tell me. Seek consensus building, work towards institutionalizing decolonized written work into your system. So I mentioned that framework document. Hiring of Indigenous consultants is important. That also holds space and allows you to see voice from a different perspective. So we did that when we looked at our communications externally. We hired an Indigenous consultant, all woman owned firm, and they really helped us understand that we were actually doing harm by adding to the invisibility narrative of LGBTQ+ and Indigenous women in conservation spaces, because we didn't have enough of those images on our website. We're holding roundtables with tribal nations and representatives to understand food sovereignty and land justice issues. So we're directly hearing from our partners on the issues that are important to them. Meeting on their homelands. We just recently did that at Oke and Wingay and heard about the importance of the sacred sites in their area from their voice. So yeah, I guess that's where I'll end it because I know I'm a little bit over, and I'll open it for questions. I know that's a lot of information, and I just want to thank everybody for listening to my presentation. I hope it was what you'd hope for. Well, Annan.
Thank you. Thank you very much for using your voice and presenting. There's a couple questions in the chat, I think, and certainly lots of virtual applause here in the background. So yeah, just a couple of links that folks have shared. Dan Vimont asks about this link. Is this the reference to land dispossession that was mentioned?
Yes, I believe so. Yep, teaching Indigenous land dispossession in Wisconsin and beyond. Yep, that's the link.
Cool. Okay.
And I did not know that Robin Wall Kimmerer was a UW grad. What? Look at us Badgers. We're everywhere.
Exactly. Even my daughter, 15-year-old daughter, just said, someone just said Robin Wall Kimmerer because they read her now in high school.
I have to tell you, I was so struck by that book that I started growing sweetgrass. And it really worked. And it was amazing. Actually got out of control. Yeah, it was an awesome experience.
Very good. Cool. Questions from the audience? I mean, feel free to unmute or raise your hand. I always welcome in particular questions from students. So I'll ask one question, which is that, so this series tends to have, and as I see some familiar names in the audience, a number of folks who are broadly climate scientists and primarily not of Indigenous background. And so I guess some of the questions is like, well, in terms of the work we do in terms of climate change science and what are some things, based on the great advice you gave at the end that we should be thinking about in terms of decolonizing our work or being able to contribute to understanding climate and climate change on native lands, in wilderness lands, et cetera, and so on?
Yeah, I think a really great example comes from a conference it was a climate conference held by ITEP, actually, the Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals. It happens every 2 years. Highly encourage this group to go to that conference, support it. Some really great presentations there. And what comes to mind is I'm going to say the acronym, but I can't remember, Climate Adaptation Science Center, maybe, CASC, and their work with Glifwick. So y'all have a language. Science people have a language, just like legal people, we have a language, and it doesn't always make sense to people in my community. Is not that they're not brilliant. It's just that they're not used to the language. And so I feel like there is some sort of a translation process that has to happen with communicating the issues. And I think CASC and Glifwick did a great job of working together to identify, look, sturgeon are in the red, and that's an important clan and relative for Ojibwe people. So they were able to create like this red, yellow, green poster that they could put around community, which is easily like a kindergartner can understand. Red is like very dangerous. Yellow is kind of, you have to go slow, and green is like, it's okay. So wild rice and sturgeon were in that red category, if I recall correctly. And Ashley, correct me if I'm wrong, because I think you were there. But it was a very easy study. I mean, amongst all the science stuff that you guys do, for community to understand, like, this is where we need to do the hard work. So to me, more examples like what Cass did with Glifwick would be great in community. It also centered Indigenous kind of stories and voice about those relatives, right? So the fact that elders shared that they were collecting later, or the season wasn't as long, that was equally important to the science and the study and the materials as some of the actual like Western science was. So again, I would check out that CEQ guidance that the Office of Science, Technology and Policy just issued, because I think it does a really good job of recommending how science can work with nations to integrate tech. Does that answer your question, Anchor?
Yeah, no, you touch on some important points that I was thinking about, and some of the challenges I've had in my own science in terms of translating and communicating, for sure, and partnerships.
There's a question here. Thank you, Martha. Do you observe that Indigenous spiritual traditions inform climate conservation work? Yes, absolutely. So there isn't like, you'll notice in NEPA processes or stuff that there isn't like a spiritual consideration necessarily. You're having to argue that it's a sacred site, and then having to prove that. And that's hard to do as an oral, traditional, tribal nations are like oral traditionalists. So there is difficulty with that. But I also think that that is, on a personal level, it guides the work that a lot of Indigenous people do. And it isn't, what I find is interesting, it isn't weird to talk about that in tribal community, maybe having a dream that kind of sends a purpose to what you do and how you show up for work. And that is, it would be weird for me to talk about that here, right? But that exists in our communities, and we take that very seriously. I don't know if Ashley, you have anything to add, or Mama T. I got my mom on the line here to help me.
Great. But if you don't have anything to add, I do see a hand up from Dan Vimont. So go ahead and unmute.
Hi, thanks very much for the talk. That was wonderful. I'm glad you brought up the Midwest cask, and I think there's a lot more on the horizon with that as well, especially in working with tribal led projects there. And so I was trying to find a reference for that, but there's a lot more coming out with the Midwest cask, and so I'm really glad you highlighted that. I think it is exciting to see that, especially tribally led research that really is a dialogue and respects that. So thanks so much for your work as well.
Thank you, Dan. I appreciate that. I'm excited to see the things that are going to come out, because I was very inspired by that presentation.
Cool. Thank you very much. We're just at time, so if there isn't anything more, let's there's a question from Damaris Colin. I do have a question for TWS: how Indigenous people manage for human-wildlife conflict issues.
So a little bit more, so how do we mean human-wildlife conflict issues? Can you help me understand the question a little bit more?
Damaris, if you want to unmute, or for livestock purposes.
Okay. Yeah, I think there is this tension right now that we're trying to work through, how we show up and be a good partner as it relates to bison restoration and some of the initiatives to restore bison as wildlife. And then, you know, whether TWS supports that definition is a difficulty, but the more that we're transparent about it, I think the better. And I think that that is a difficult question, actually, for me to answer. But I do think that we have to thoughtfully, again, we go back to our NLP framework document and think through these issues. But that's how I kind of see that one, where we've been in a position where we can't just come out and say, yeah, we support bison as wildlife, and where they can have the same principles of like deer would, roaming anywhere. That there are some concerns that we're mindful of in Montana, where that could be a problem. But again, being honest about it with our partners is the best way we can approach that issue. And also being open to where we may not have knowledge, right? And finding that knowledge from partners. Like an example is we're kind of talking about 638 right now. There's a lot of, and 638 is like compact contract management. It's a mechanism that can be used to manage forest spaces, national forest spaces. And right now it's being piloted by some tribes. Yurok is one of those tribes. Actually, they're doing under Good Neighbor Authority. But the idea is that we need to get more information because it's important to our tribal partners. And in the past, we haven't been supportive of expanding 638 or GNA. So getting more information is important to that process. And so that's what we're doing right now.
Cool. Fascinating. Okay, if there isn't anything else, let's go ahead and end today's CPEP seminar. Thank you very, very much again for coming and presenting, and hopefully we'll be leading to further conversations and discussions and actions as well from our side. So just to announce next week's talk, March 7th, will be Luke Nave, who's at the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Sciences up in Houghton, Michigan. He will be coming to talk about climate change in forests, so adaptation and mitigation as management goals. So continue to hear some more questions about how we manage lands for understanding and protecting them. So see you next week all, and thank you for joining today.
Poso.